In today's video, I'm going to be comparing 9 different major brands of fine liners. I'm really excited to do this. I've been wanting to do it for ages, especially with Housetober coming up in just a few days, where I'll be doing a different ink drawing daily. I wanted to figure out the best fine liner to use. So I'll be looking at these 9 different fine liners, and I'll be comparing different things. There's the design of the fine liner, which is how comfortable it is, the design of the barrel, whether the cap goes off or on easily, whether it's less or more likely to dry out because of that, etc. And then I'll have a drawing category where I actually do a little sketch with each one and do different mark making and see what kind of textural effects I can get. And then finally, a waterplay category where I look at how it interacts with water and watercolor. And do keep in mind that I am just one opinionated artist, and I'm going to have different biases for each of these. I'm going to try to check all of those at the door and look at all of these with an open mind as if I didn't have experience with them. But I will be telling you some of my past experiences with them because there's only so much you can do with just one little small drawing. Part of getting to know a fine liner is really using it. I would recommend just using this video as a resource to look at the different fine liners and see what kind of different marks that can be made with them. And any opinions that I express, you can listen to them, but you're going to make your own opinions over time, and that's fine too. And together we'll keep all of these art companies in business, which is a good thing. I'm not going to be looking at rapidograph pens, fountain pens, or dip pens, or anything except for fine liners in this video. Although I do like for my fine liners to give the illusion of being a fountain pen or a dip pen. So I'm looking for something that has some versatility where it can give me straight lines, but it can also give me jagged lines or textured lines or variable weight lines. And because I'm a watercolor artist who really likes to do line and wash paintings, which is ink and watercolor, I'm going to be looking at things a little bit differently than some people might be interested in. Specifically, I'm going to be testing these on cold pressed watercolor paper because that's how I like to use them. And I'm going to be testing them with watercolor only and not alcohol markers or any of those things. I'm really interested in seeing how the fine liners behave on a cold pressed or textured watercolor paper, because if they do well on a textured paper, they're going to do pretty well on a smooth paper as well. And it's going to give me more information with how to use them in the way that I like to paint. So with that said, I'll introduce you to our 9 fine liners. First are the uni pens. And these are really easy to find in the UK. I actually bought 2 different ones because I wanted to have a 0.05, and this one carried one and this one didn't. In fact, this one also has a 0.03. And because I like to draw really fine, because I like to do a lot of tiny paintings, those sizes were important to me. But you can find a set that includes the smaller sizes and not have to buy 2. And for the aesthetics on all of these, I'll be looking at the 0.1. The barrel itself has a matte finish, which I like, and it doesn't feel that there are any sharp edges. The cap is pretty easy to get off, and it's a bit more difficult to get onto the bottom, but it does fit nicely there, so you don't have to worry about losing the cap. The edge here feels fairly smooth. It's a little bit sharp, but not bad. This is nicely rounded, and I don't feel like anything is too sharp to touch. That is important to me when I go to draw. It's got a nice snap when you take the cap off, and it fits really nicely back onto the barrel. And the height on these is about 5.5 inches or 14 centimeters. Next are the Pentel point liners. This is an extended kit, but you can also get them with a smaller amount. You don't need to buy all of these. They're fade and water resistant, indelible pigment ink, and again, they're pretty affordable and pretty easy to find. The Pentels have a really nice aesthetic as well. They're a little bit shinier than the uni pins, so they don't have a matte finish. The finish is a bit glossier. The lid comes off easily and goes on the back of the pen pretty easily as well. And there are no sharp edges along the barrel. It has a nice steel tip that the nib goes into. There's a tiny bit of sharpness here, but nothing that I feel like my fingers are going to catch on. It's a little bit sharper, I'd say, than the uni pin, but it isn't bad. And then to take the cap off, it goes on pretty easily. And these are made in Japan. These are a little more than 5.5 inches and about 14.3 centimeters. Next up are the Prismacolor Premier Fineliners. And these are a definite favorite of mine. So it's going to be really interesting to see how they compare to some of the others. They used to make, I don't know if they still do, but they used to sell brown ones that I really liked. They were a nice dark brown, and I did a whole sketchbook of tiny paintings just with that color. And I've done Housetober 2 years in a row using only these. And I really only use the 0.05 and the 0.1. So I find these to be incredibly versatile, and I really, really like them. These also are made in Japan. And I'm not sure if Prismacolor has changed things lately. I know that they used to be really easy to find at the Michaels stores in the US, and you can still find the sets, but you can't buy the single pens there as easily anymore. And I can't buy the brown ones at all, not anywhere where my mother lives when I visit, anyhow. And I cannot get these pens in the UK, which is one reason that I'm doing this comparison to see if I can find something that I like better. I bought these new so that I had the current ones to compare, and it has a shiny barrel, which I quite like. I love the way these feel in my hands. Now, I am a woman and I do have smaller hands than a man would have, so that might have something to do with it. The caps are a little bit stiff at first, but these do, or at least they did in my current ones, get a little bit looser with use, so they're not difficult, and they fit very nicely on the back. The thing that I really love about these is this is completely smooth to touch. There are no sharp edges at all, and that makes it really comfortable to use. Maybe it's because I have such a long history with these, but they're so comfortable to use. And then the caps go on pretty easily. I do find that on this newer set anyway, the caps are a little bit more difficult to get on, but again, that could just be because it's brand new. These are just a tad more than 5.5 inches and about 14.1 or 14.2 centimeters. Next are the Faber-Castell Pitt Artist pens, and these are the only ones that say that they have India ink. All of the others say that they have pigmented ink. And another different thing about these is they actually give letters to the different sizes. So if you use them exclusively, that's great. If you don't, it could be a little bit confusing, but obviously not a deal breaker. They used to be easier to find in the UK at different shops, but lately I've had a little bit more trouble locating these. The numbers are located on the barrel next to the letters, so you could figure it out. It's not really a deal breaker, it's just something to know about them, and for some people that might be a real bonus. These come in at about 5.5 inches or 14 centimeters. They have a shiny barrel and a matte ridged cap, and they have the size on the cap here as well. And they are made in Germany. Aesthetically, there's nothing wrong with them. I don't love the feel of them. Although they're shiny here, they're matte here at the top, and then glossy here again at the very tip. So that's a little confusing, but I suppose if you're gonna hold the pen here, it's more matte. But if you're holding the pen back here, I don't know. I don't love that personally. And this ridge is not too bad. A little bit sharp, not bad. This is rounder. I don't know, something about it feels a little bit lighter than some of the other ones. It feels a bit lighter than the Pentel, as well as the Unipins, and even the Prismacolors. It's a subtle difference that most people might not mind, and it might actually be a bonus if you're traveling and you want to keep your gear really light. The cap goes onto the back of the pen very easily and snaps back on easily as well. Next are the Winsor&Newton Fineliners, and I apologize because I don't have packaging for this one. These are beautiful in their aesthetic design. They have a nice matte finish that feels really nice in your hand. They don't have any markings, so anything you want to know about it would be on the packaging, which I will put a little picture of up in the corner. So it just has the name and the number of the Fineliner. And these are the 5 that come in their standard package. I just realized that they do make a 0.05, but I had to order that separately. I'm hoping that it's going to arrive before I finish this review, but if not, we're just going to do the best we can with these. The lid comes off really easily, and also goes on the base nicely. And there are absolutely no sharp edges here on the barrel or the tip. The nib size is nice. There's a bevel that goes all the way down, which is a bit different than all of the others that seem to have a little bit of a ridge leading to this steel bit at the tip. Now, I don't have a lot of experience using these. I do have a friend who likes these a lot, and she says that they do go dry a little bit more quickly, but that she really likes that because she can get a lot of different dry effects with the fine liners. So that's something just to keep in mind. And the lid goes back on pretty nicely as well. I do have to say, I could see that you might have to make sure that you keep these closed. I could easily envision a scenario where you'd think it was on, but it didn't do that final push, and that might contribute to it drying out a little bit more quickly. So that's just something to keep in mind. These are the tallest of the fine liners that I'm reviewing. They're almost 6 inches and about 15.1 centimeters. And for that reason alone, I haven't used them because they didn't fit into the art kit that I used to use. Although now that I'm using the Sendak, I think they would fit in there, and that little bit of extra height wouldn't really be an issue. But that is something to consider if you have a pencil case or someplace where you're keeping your supplies and the height is limited. Next, I'll be looking at the Staedtler pigment liners. I do have a lot of experience with these, and I do know that I really like this brand. So I'm coming into it with a bias that I'm going to try to set aside. These are also made in Germany, but I would rate these as a higher quality than the Faber-Castell, just based on my own personal experience. And I love this set. I've bought this set several times for myself as well as my daughter. It has all of the pens that you need as well as an extra chisel, which I don't really use, but some people might really like that. I love the feel of these. It has a nice matte finish that's really smooth but not too slippery to touch. And I can't help but compare this to the Faber-Castell, which is also made in Germany. And whereas that one has a lot of different textures going on, this one is really continuous throughout. And it has the sizes on the top of the cap. The cap comes off easily and secures nicely to the base. There are no sharp edges here along the barrel towards the tip. I feel a little bit of a bump here, but not a sharp one, just a little bit of a bevel maybe. And then the steel tip also has a nice smooth feel to it under my fingers. I noticed that it does say this 12 hours cap off, and that's also something that's really beneficial to think about when you're going to use a fine liner. Unless you're somebody who always puts the cap back on, they can dry out more quickly. So they are touting the fact that you can take the cap off and it's not going to dry out your fine liner. And the cap goes on pretty easily as well. And when you put the cap on, you have to push a bit, but it gives a nice snap. The size on these is a bit shorter than some of the others. It's a little bit less than 5.5 inches and about 13.6 centimeters. These Copic multi-liners were recommended to me by some of you, so I wanted to try them. The price on these is going to vary depending on where you live, but I can tell you that these were definitely much more expensive than all of the other ones that I've tried so far. So these and the next ones are at the highest price point. They are refillable, but the refillable part is a little bit questionable because you're not refilling the cartridge that's already in there. You're completely replacing the cartridge, and you can also completely replace the nib. And it almost feels like that's not really cost effective. And those replacement parts aren't that affordable either. So I'm not sure how I feel about that. You're still putting tons of plastic into landfills, and you're still having to spend a lot of money and still use the same old barrel. Like the Staedtler and the Faber-Castell, these are a German product, but they're actually made in Japan. For the price of these, I'm really not impressed that it comes in this kind of cheap plastic packaging. I mean, when you compare this to the Staedtler or to some of the companies like Pentel or Unipin that are actually using cardboard, which is definitely more environmentally friendly, this gets a big thumbs down from me right away. And the height on this is about 5.5 inches or 14 centimeters. It has the size of the nib on the base as well as the top of the cap. The barrel itself is really pretty. It's got a glittery design on it. And it says that it has the pigment ink, it's water and Copic proof, which I believe means that it does well with alcohol markers, which I won't be testing here. But if that's something that you're interested in, or if that's the type of art that you like to do, that might be something that's of use to you. The lid comes off really easily and doesn't fit on the base that well. I mean, it does fit on there, but it doesn't have a bevel for the cap to actually go on there easily. Like all of the other brands that I've looked at so far, you have to give it a little bit of a shove, which I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that, but it does come off pretty easily. I don't know if that would stretch it out over time and make it not fit as well, but something to think about. It is completely beveled. There's a little bit of an edge that I can feel here, but it isn't sharp. And it feels a bit chunkier than the other ones. Many of the other brands have a smaller portion here. And if you have bigger hands, this might be really nice, but I'm not sure how I feel about that, but we'll see. It's really sweet. It has a nice steel tip that's long, but the nib itself on the 0.1 is kind of short, which means it's going to wear out more quickly. I'm being a little bit harder on this one simply because of the price. The cap does go on easily. I do worry as well that this would stretch out and not hold its shape very well. It doesn't feel as expensive as it is, if that makes sense. But anyway, let's give it a try. Maybe I'll love them and change my mind. Next are the Molotov black liners. And this is also a brand that I haven't tried before, so this is going to be brand new to me, but these were another one that were recommended by some of you. And again, for these, I think that you can buy sets that don't have quite as many. I think in both the US and the UK, these and the Copics are the most expensive of all the ones that I've looked at so far, and all of the ones that I'm looking at today. These are also made in Germany, and I do like the Molotov masking fluid pen, so I thought it was worth trying these. These have a black matte barrel and cap, and they're similar to the Unipins in that they have this little window where you can see the tip through it, although the window is opaque, so you can't actually see the tip through it. But compared to the Copics, it has a nice snappy little bit here on the edge of the cap. And again, it lists the number of the pen on the top of the cap as well as on the base of the barrel. It has a nice feel to it. The lid comes off easily. It doesn't have a dedicated area, but it slides on there pretty well. And this area is completely smooth. I feel nothing rough whatsoever. And the depth of the nib looks pretty good as well. And the cap goes back on pretty easily as well. The length on these is a little more than 5.5 inches or about 14.2 centimeters. The last Fineliners that I'm going to look at are the Pigma Micron Fineliners. I purchased this set that starts from 005 to 08 and then gives a variable width extra one. And I have to tell you right from the beginning that I have never met a Micron that I liked. I have a long-standing grudge against them. I've tried, but I don't get the hype. And yes, I've bought them from reputable art stores, and yes, I've tried them more than once. I find that they leak. I don't like the caps. But in the interest of doing this thorough comparison, I thought maybe that was then. Maybe things are going to be better now. And so many people speak so highly of them that maybe there's something to that. Personally, I think that people like them because they were the first Fineliners. However, that doesn't mean the pen itself is the best. The company that creates them is Royal Talens. They're made in Japan. The barrel of the pen is a little bit glossy and it has this shiny metallic bit at the top with the number on the top of the cap as well as written next to the label. I feel right away, I don't know if this picks up on the camera, but all of the writing is a bit crooked and that right away is a bit off-putting to me. Obviously, the function of the pen has nothing to do with the writing, but it does make me wonder where else they've cut corners. The lid is pretty difficult to get off compared to all of the others. And it does snap nicely onto the bottom, unlike some of the other ones that I've had. right away here, this ridge is quite sharp, so they haven't fixed that. This is more beveled and smooth up here, and it has the nice metal tip. But again, this part's shiny, whereas this part's matte, and with this being rough, I don't love that. And again, it's very difficult to get the caps on. If you're not really conscious of that, these could easily dry out. You have to really work to get them off and on. And that is one of the reasons that I've disliked them in the past. But let's give them a try and see what it's like to draw with them. The length is a little more than 5¼ inches or 13½ centimeters. For this drawing portion, I'm going to be looking at different things like mark making and how I'm able to acquire different textures. I'll be creating a little drawing with each fineliner, and I'll be talking about my real-time thoughts as I do it. I've sped up the drawing process a little bit, but if you're interested in seeing the real-time version, you can head on over to my Patreon where I'll be posting that. I like the feeling of the 0.03. I always love when a brand carries something this fine because I can get some really light values with it. And if I go on the side, I can get some nice skipping motions. Overall, I'm not finding that big of a difference between the 0.03 and the 0.05 yet. I've used these uni pins quite a bit in the past, and overall I really like the way that I can draw with them. I do like the fact that I have a 0.03 and a 0.05. I don't notice a huge difference between the two unless I go to make a really fine value, in which case the 0.03 is definitely going to be stronger. And I'm able to get both fine lines as well as darker ones, which is really helpful. One bonus about the uni pins is that they're really easy to find in the UK. I can go into just about any store and I can find them, and they're relatively affordable as well. Because I have used these quite a bit in the past, one thing that I've noticed about them is that they tend to fade a little bit underneath watercolor. So when I put watercolor on top, oftentimes I'll have to go in and add just a little bit on top of that. And also if I go to draw on top of a white marker, they don't like that. They don't like that at all, which is fine. I mean, fine liners aren't made to do that. But for purely drawing, they work perfectly well. There's a nice range. If I wanted to go in with a darker value, I could do that. And they feel really nice to use. There's no sharp edges. I like the fact that they have this little window here. It's just a nice aesthetic design. They're made in Vietnam by the Mitsubishi Pencil Company. Unipin Fine Line Water and Fade Proof Pigment Ink. So in terms of drawing, I would definitely continue to use these. I like them. They're easy to get. They're affordable. I'm going to wait and rate all of these after I've used all of them to sort of compare them to one another. But tentatively speaking, I would rate these pretty highly. I'd say in terms of their design and their drawing capabilities. Overall, with the Pentel, I like the way that they work. I actually, to be honest, haven't used them as much on just normal drawing as I have on like craft drawing, although I did use them in our more recent collaboration. And to me, they feel very much like the Unipin, but maybe a little bit more graphic. I don't know. I feel when I draw with these that I want to get really detailed in a way that with the Unipin, I don't have that same inspiration. But with the Pentel, I feel like I could just keep going. I felt like I could have just kept developing this drawing and gone with it for ages. And I think that it's something about the way that I can get really fine lines and I can achieve a lot of different mark making with these much more easily. I'm actually a little bit surprised because I didn't realize I liked these as much as I do. And they are pretty affordable. I don't know how easy they are to find compared to some of the other ones. These are ones that you would probably want to buy online at an art store or maybe even Amazon, but they feel really comfortable to use. These feel so familiar to me. They still feel exactly the same as the ones that I have. Maybe I'm not able to get as fine of a line as I usually do, but I think that's because I use my pens for a long time. and I like to use them as they start to really wear out. And one thing I can tell you about these is it takes a really long time for them to wear out, or at least the ones that I've had in the past. I've been able to do an entire tiny sketchbook with just 1 or 2 pens, which I think is pretty remarkable. And when I did Housetober last year, I used the same 2 pens for 30 different sketches. So in that way, I would rate them pretty highly. I like the way that they look on textured watercolor paper. They look a lot more organic than some of the other pens, I think. But maybe they're not as skippy as the Pentel, so that's something definitely to consider in the future. I think the skippiness, perhaps, that I've been able to get from them in the past has been due to the fact that some of my pens are a little bit older. So maybe that would be a tip if you used these, just to make sure that you're using your pens as much as you can and don't throw them away. If you like to have that skippy look, use some of the older ones that are maybe wearing down at the nib a little bit more. But I do really love these. They're so comfortable in my hand. So I would rate this one pretty highly for both design and drawing. A few things that I can say about the Faber-Castell: I'm not in love with them. I find them to be a little bit scratchy to use and also a little bit unpredictable. If I'm looking at the 0.1 and the 0.3 and I try to do some drawing on the side, I'm not able to get the skippy kind of texture that I like in a predictable way. So what happens when I'm drawing is I'll get light bits where I don't want them and dark bits where I don't want them, as opposed to being able to make an educated decision about where I want to put deliberate effects. I also find that the variety with these is a bit, I don't know, kind of samey. The 3, 5, and 7 all have a very similar effect to me. Although I would say the 0.5 or the F, which makes it a little bit confusing. You have XXS, then XS, then S. I'm all down with that, but then it goes to F to M. And there probably is a reason that it does that. I don't know it. If you know it, let me know in the comments. But anyhow, I find that the F is actually probably the most effective at being able to get some of the lighter, skippy textures that I like to place in some areas, next to the 0.05, where I can get a little bit of scribbling, but it's more just a messy hatching and not that kind of skippy texture that I like to get on the edge of some of the Fineliners. So I don't love these. My experience with them is that they tend to dry out a little bit more quickly as well. And again, maybe this has something to do with the India ink. I'm not particularly sure, but I'm not able to get the variety of value in the same way that I am with some of the others, especially the Prismacolor. So of the 4 that I've tried so far, the Unipin, the Pentel, the Prismacolor, and these are definitely lowest on the list. I mean, could I use them? Yes. Do I feel that I want to use them? No. So far, these are definitely bottom of the barrel for me. I was a little bit down on these and almost didn't include them in this comparison because I didn't have a 0.05 or anything smaller than a 0.1, but I'm really happy that I did. And also, it was a little bit more difficult to find them. There's a big store in the UK called Hobbycraft where you can buy a lot of art supplies, and they used to carry brands like this, and I know they still do online, but in my local shop, it's a lot more difficult to find anything other than their generic Hobbycraft brand. And that, coupled with the fact that I couldn't find a set of them that included a 0.05, I had to actually purchase the 0.05 separately. It just left a bad impression on me. But it is Winsor&Newton. I love their paints and I love many of their other products. So I did want to include it. And in the end, I'm really pleased that I did because I got a bit swept away when I was drawing with these. They felt really nice. I really do judge a Fineliner partly based on how it makes me feel. Do I feel like I want to draw with it when I'm using it? And this one, the time got away from me. I had to make myself stop. I could have continued drawing. Part of it is I liked the subject matter, but a bigger part of it is that I really liked the feeling of these pens. So this is a Fineliner that I definitely plan to revisit in the future and use a bit more. I'll be interested to see if mine dry out more quickly than some of the other ones, like the Prismacolor. I don't know that that would be a deal breaker for me, again, because I do really like to have a selection of pens that are a little bit drier because I'm able to get a larger variety of textures and effects with that. I apologize for the way that I did the little test of the pens. I got all confused with the numbers, so I just went with it. And if I do get the 0.05, I will put it in here somewhere just so that you can see the comparison of that. I was able to achieve enough light textures, I think, with the 0.1, but without a 0.05, I don't know that I would use it. I definitely, for me anyway, would want that smaller nib size, but I'm really pleasantly surprised with these. I would say so far, this is definitely up there with the Prismacolor, and I will be exploring these more in the future. I knew that I liked the Staedtler before doing this little comparison, but I didn't realize how superior they are to many of the other brands that I use on a daily basis. Even the Prismacolor. I'm not going to diss the Prismacolor because I still do really love those. But these Staedtlers are next level. Not only the feel of them, but the real variation between the smaller sizes. Whereas on some of the other ones, the differences felt a little bit more samey. On this one, I really noticed a difference between the 0.05, the 0.1, and the 0.3, and even the 0.3 and the 0.5. The nibs on all of these feel like they're a little bit longer. I'll do some type of a nib comparison just to show you the differences between that. But that gives me a lot of versatility in terms of what different textures and effects I want to include in a drawing. I really enjoyed using these. They felt fast. I know that maybe sounds weird, but they felt really smooth, and it almost felt like I was sort of taken over and I was able to draw effortlessly and have a lot of different free mark making with these. And I would put that down 100% to the design. You really feel like you're using a professional fine liner when you use these. And I'm really interested to compare this to the next two, which are a lot more expensive and which I have absolutely no experience with. I do remember the first time I heard about Staedtler when I was pretty new to fine liners. I was teaching at the university and there was this little independent art store, and I used to work with the owner of the store to put together art kits for my students and work with him on getting the most affordable supplies for everybody, because it's important to have good supplies, but it's also important not to break the budget. Anyhow, I remember him telling me that he had a representative from Staedtler who came in and really talked up these fine liners and said how superior they were. And I always thought that he also talked about how they were refillable. And I've tried to explore seeing whether they really are or not. And although I can find refills for some of their other markers and pens, I can't find a refill for the pigment liners. So it could be that my memory is faulty and he was talking about some other pen that Staedtler makes. But even if these aren't refillable, they're an A+ for me. You really can't go wrong. If you could only get one of these, so far, I would encourage you to invest in these and try them and see what you think about them. I also really like the case that this comes with. I like that there's a little individual spot for each of the pens. If you just like to do ink drawing, you don't even need a pencil case because it's really versatile and you can take it with you anywhere. You could keep your favorite pens in there. If it was me, I would probably take out the last two and maybe put in a few extras of the 0.05 and the 0.1, but this would last you several drawings and you wouldn't be disappointed. Overall, I had no problem using these. They felt really nice to touch. I didn't get enough of a variation between the different sizes. It felt like the 0.1 and the 0.3 were quite similar, and the 0.05 had a smaller nib. The nib was actually a bit shorter and didn't do everything that I would have liked it to do. So I wasn't really able to get enough of a variation in value because of that. It was pleasant. My biggest complaint about this was the design of the barrel. I found the caps a bit more difficult to take off and then to put back on. Again, there's that problem of not having a dedicated channel at the base of the pen for the cap to rest in, so it does feel like it gets stretched out. and it also felt like I had to push pretty hard to get the cap back on. And I really don't like the fiddly bit of this stem on the edge of the cap. It really feels like it's just a recipe for getting bent out of shape or breaking off. In terms of the bevel at the tip of the pen, that was really quite comfortable. I had a lot of fun drawing with these, but are they worth the price? I wouldn't say so, especially if you're comparing them to the Staedtler, which I just drew with, or even the Winsor&Newton or the Prismacolor. They didn't feel like they were anything special. That said, they do make some darker brown colors that I've ordered to see if I might like those, because I'm having trouble sourcing the Prismacolor brown fine liners that I really like. And the Staedtler makes a dark sepia or a dark brown that I really love, but I can only find it in 0.3. So again, you may see me using these in terms of using the brown ones, but would I purchase these? Would I recommend them? Would I put them in my kit? I mean, I might use up the ones that I have, but they're definitely lower on my list. And for the price point, I would just give them an okay. If these were more affordable, would I feel differently? Maybe a little. I'd probably be a lot kinder, but I still really wouldn't like the aesthetics of the design. I would even put these up with the Faber-Castell in thinking that I just really am not a fan of the design of the barrel itself. So with that and the packaging and that flimsy little piece, that stem on the cap, I wouldn't put these at the top of the list. But drawing-wise, they do give a nice consistent line quality. If you don't like to have texture or a scribbly effect, if you're going just for line art, you might like these. I really wasn't loving these as I first did the swatching of the different sizes. In particular, I found that if I put the pen on the side of the nib, I really found it difficult to get any kind of ink from it, and definitely not any ink that I could see consistently. So again, for me, that's a downside. If you're just wanting to do line art, it might not bother you as much. I felt like these were fine. I enjoyed drawing with them. Aside from the fact that I couldn't get any of the side textures, I was able to get some textures that I liked. The line work was fine. I liked the 0.05 especially, and the 0.1. In fact, I did most of this little drawing using just those two nibs. However, I did really feel like it compared a lot more closely to the Faber-Castell. And considering that these were probably the most expensive fine liners of all of them, with the exception of the Copics, I wouldn't invest in it. It doesn't seem worth it to me. I don't even know, quite honestly, if I'm going to use these fine liners. I might end up just gifting them to somebody that I know who I think could make better use of them. It's not that there's anything really horrible about them. It's just that I have so many others that I prefer and can do more with. And again, for the cost of them, they just don't deliver. In terms of comfort, they were quite comfortable to use. I didn't have any issues with that. It was more the limitations that I found with the different nibs. So I would say I really didn't feel that I was able to be as artistic with them because of some of those problems with not being able to go on the side of the nib. And I didn't really feel like I could be very experimental because of that. So I think that my drawing has a little bit less energy to it. And personally, I would probably encourage you to save your money and go with one of the other brands that I feel are better and are also going to save your pocketbook. Overall, these were a lot better than I remembered them. That's the good news. The bad news is I still don't love them. That said, I don't hate them as much as I used to, but I found that if I tried to do the type of reworking that I would normally do with any of the other fine liners, it just has a tendency to get bogged down with too much ink. And so I would imagine if you had the kind of style where your line work was very intentional and deliberate, that these would be really good because you could just put the line down once and be done with it. But I like to do a lot of hatching and cross hatching, and I like to do different pressure on the nib as I draw with it. Not crazy, but just a little bit of a variance. And I found that this just got really dark really fast, even the 005, but the 01 definitely felt more like an 03 to me. And I don't love the drawing I did, so maybe that's part of it, but I think it's a little bit more than that. I tried with the distant hill and some of the foreground just to see what kind of texture I could get with it, but I just didn't get that magical feeling that I get with some of the other ones, like the Prismacolor or the Staedtler, or even a little bit the Winsor&Newton. So I would have to say, if you like microns, I understand now. We probably have very different styles and they would suit your style. They don't really suit my style, and especially using them on textured paper, which isn't the only way that I draw, by the way. It's just the more recent way in the last few years that I like to use them. I do think that they perform much better on a smooth paper. So for a line and wash drawing on a textured paper, I'd probably give it a pass. But I'm not going to throw any shade at them anymore. I'm not going to say that they're awful. I definitely can understand the appeal now that I'm coming at them fresh with a brand new perspective and a more open mind. All of the fine liners that I'm looking at today are light fast, archival, and waterproof. Or so they say. Now that I've done the drawing, it's time to look at the Waterplay. So do any of these fine liners bleed? And if so, which ones? And how do they look when I put watercolor on top? And also, how do they look when I draw on top of watercolor? I started out by adding water to the ink drawings themselves, and I was really surprised to see that a lot of them really turned colors and bled a lot. And then I realized that I think I may have had a little bit of paint left on my paintbrush. And when I was cleaning it in between, I was actually cross-contaminating the different pictures. So after that, I went ahead and used a water brush and made sure it was clean in between testing it. And I actually tested it on white paper to be sure that it was. And so when you look at these results, you want to look at the far right column for all of the pen types where I've done the hatching. And I ran the clean brush over those. So that's going to be a more accurate representation of how waterproof these are, more so than looking at the ink drawings themselves. Rookie mistake. And I'm giving it a real scrub a little bit more so than I would do if I was painting, just to really see a fair estimate of how much they do or don't bleed. These are dry now, so I feel like I have a better grasp about which ones bleed more than others. So I would say definitely the Unipin bleeds a bit, and that is something that I've noticed with them. I didn't realize they bleed quite as much as they actually do. The Pentel also bleeds a little bit more, and there's a slight amount of discoloration around the Prismacolor, but for me that wouldn't be enough to make me not use them. The Faber-Castell bled really badly in this drawing, but it isn't so bad here on the strip. So I'm really not sure, but since I didn't love those markers anyway, that probably doesn't matter one way or another. The Winsor&Newton doesn't seem to have bled much at all. The Staedtler has a little bit of discoloration. The Molitor, interestingly, is pretty bad here, although it seemed more subtle, maybe not. So a little bit of subtle bleeding there, and a little bit with the Copics, and a little bit with the microns. So there seems to be, when you put a lot of ink on the paper, even allowing it time to dry, I mean, there's a little bit of pickup. So I'll let you decide. I'm not sure about the user error. Again, there might have been some pigment stuck in this brush. It seemed to be clean. If I test it now, yeah, I thought it was clean. So I do think this was all the result of the ink, but there might have been some cross-contamination from one to the next, if that makes sense. So I think that maybe the Faber-Castell contaminated the Winsor&Newton just a little bit, because if I look at that strip, it's really clean. So I'll let you decide who's the winner on that category, because I'm really a little bit at a loss and a little bit surprised, actually. I would say probably the ones that bother me the least, looking at it from afar and not on the camera, just looking at it through my eyes, are the Prismacolor, the Staedtler, the Winsor&Newton. Next, I'm going to take a little bit of transparent color. I think this is an ultramarine or a French ultramarine, and I'm going to do a strip on each of them. I think I'll do it just in the parts where I've done some cross hatching, just to see what the coverage is like on each one. And while I'm letting those dry, I'm going to do another strip of color at the bottom of each one. I'll choose a different color just to help differentiate things. And then I want to scribble over those, just do a little bit of mark making over that once it's dry to see what the coverage is like over the watercolor. The 4 in the top row did the best. They didn't bleed. When I put watercolor on top, they retained their vibrancy, and I was also able to draw on top of the watercolor pretty effortlessly. So I would say for the Winsor&Newton, Prismacolor, Copics, and Staedtler, they were all pretty much of a muchness. They were all very dependable. And my experience with the Prismacolor and Staedtler are that they handle water applications and water really well. The bleeders are down in the bottom row, and they're in the order of least worst to worst. The Faber-Castell had just a little bit of trace bleeding, not even very much. They could almost be in the top row. But the Pentel and the Unipin, the Molitor and the Micron, they all bled to varying degrees. With the Molitor, it seemed to be a little more subtle, but there were enough problems with that marker anyway, especially with the texture effects and the inconsistency of the Fineliners. Certain Fineliners were just drier than others. So after looking at all 3 categories and doing these drawings pretty much over the course of a few days, so they're all fresh in my mind, I have decided on who the winners are for me, and I'll share those with you. Let me know if you agree based on your own personal experience or by what you've seen me do here today. In last place are the Microns. And this probably isn't a great surprise to you. It wasn't a great surprise to me either. That said, I really didn't hate them. I put them in last place for 2 main reasons. One is because they do bleed a little bit. And also, I don't like how difficult it is to get the cap off and on. With every other one of these Fineliners, I was able to remove the cap with just one hand while I was holding something with the other hand. And this one, it's a 2-hand procedure for me anyway. If you're somebody who has arthritis or issues with your hands, I would steer away from these because they're just a lot of work, and you have to also make sure that you get the lid on tightly or they're going to dry out more quickly. And also my past experiences with them bleeding just make me keep these in the last category, although I don't dislike them the way that I used to. Number 8 is the Molitor. I liked the drawing that I was able to complete with it, but it failed me on many different levels. Number 1, the price was too much. Number 2, they seemed to be inconsistent in keeping a straight line. Some of them were drier than others, and they just weren't really reliable. And they also failed the waterproof test. They felt, in a way, very similar to the Faber-Castell. They felt a little bit drier. They're very expensive, and that's one of the reasons that I've rated them as low as I have, simply because you don't need to be spending that kind of money to get a good quality fineliner. If you live in Germany or someplace where they're more affordable, I wouldn't discourage you from using them. It's mainly because of the price point. And I don't love the design. It's okay. It's very much like the Unipin, and the Unipins are so much more affordable in both the UK and the US. So for that reason, I'm rating them a little bit lower. The watercolor seemed to go over them fine, and also I was able to draw over the watercolor pretty easily as well. Number 7 were the Faber-Castell. They mostly just felt really dry to me. I was a bit surprised that I placed these so close to the bottom, but I really didn't like the aesthetics. They felt kind of cheap. I didn't enjoy drawing with them. I didn't feel inspired. I don't even like the sketch that I did, and I think all of that comes out in how you feel about a pen. I also don't like their lettering system. I suppose if these were all I used, I'd get used to what is an S and what is an F. And even though the numbers are on there, they're kind of trickier to find. Again, this is just my opinion. Mostly though, I felt that they were really scratchy to use. They didn't feel smooth. I didn't enjoy drawing with them. They bleed a little bit, not as badly as they seemed to at first, but overall, I just really didn't enjoy them. They're also harder to find these days, probably for the aforementioned reasons. So these are lower on the list for me. Number 6 surprised me a little bit because I would have thought going into this that I would have rated them a little bit higher. And those are the uni pins. I knew that these had a tendency to fade a little bit when I added water and for the ink to lift or lighten, but I didn't realize how much of the ink actually disperses onto the paper until after doing this test. I like these, but I don't feel that I love them, if that makes sense. And I also don't feel inspired to draw with these as much. And I know that's a subtle thing. I was trying to figure out why that is, and I don't really have a definitive answer with them. But I've done an entire sketchbook with a brown Unipin 0.1 Fineliner, and I found that the inkwork isn't as engaging to me when I use the Unipins as some of the other Fineliners. Again, that's probably just a personal thing, but it is something that affects the way that I rate it. I love the price point on these. I love their availability. You can buy these in just about any art store in the UK, and that makes me rate them a little bit more highly. Like the Pentel, if I try to draw on top of white paint, these are going to clog up very quickly as well, so something to keep in mind. I think they're a perfectly good fine liner, but for the purposes of line and wash, maybe not so much. Number 5 are the Pentel. I was surprised that I liked these as much as I did because before this I sort of thought of them as maybe a lower grade, but they held their own and they have a nice solid place in the middle for me. They bled a little bit, but not too much. And I like the variety of different sizes that they offer. I enjoyed working with them. Were they my favorite? No. But where I live, they're more affordable and they have a nice variety of sizes that are pretty readily available. I was able to draw on top of the watercolor pretty easily, but I know from experience that if I tried to go over anything that's like a white paint, they can get clogged up and just be almost impossible to revive. So that made me put them a little bit towards the lower end. But they're perfectly capable and they're a nice little fine liner. Number 4 are the Copics. I feel a little bit bad rating these as highly as I did because I didn't love them. That said, I did like the drawing that I did with them. I really felt that I was having a good time as I was drawing with them. Some of the problems I have are that the ink got very dark very quickly when I tried to do hatching and cross-hatching, so that was a little bit more difficult to control. They seemed to bleed just ever so slightly, not too bad, so I really can't fault them on that. They went over the watercolor fine. I think my biggest gripe with these are how cheap they feel to me. I don't like this flimsy little flap on the cap. I don't like the fact that I have to kind of shove the cap on the base of the pen. Those are just minor aesthetic things, but they make a little bit of a difference for me. And the nib on these was shorter than the nib on all of the other ones. And for something that's so high priced, that's really just not good enough. And because these are so expensive, I would just really save your money and invest in one of the other fine liners instead. That said, I did order some sepia ones, and if I like those, you may see me using these with tiny paintings, so don't call me a hypocrite if you do. But for the black ones, there are other brands that are so much better, in my opinion. Number 3 was also a surprise to me, and those were the Winsor&Newton. I've written these off in the past. I've not used them because they were a little bit too tall and because I didn't think they made a 0.05, which I now know that they do. I almost didn't include them in this comparison because I still don't have the 0.05 to compare it. But I was able to learn enough with using the other sizes. I really liked a lot about them. The silkiness of the barrel made it really fun to draw with. There was a tiny bit of bleeding maybe, but not really noticeable. And I liked the way the fine liners looked when I added some watercolor on top. I also think that these are maybe a little bit lighter in color than some of the other ones. So they're not a very, very dark black. And for me, I really like that. If you're looking for something that's going to be a solid dark black, you may want to pass on these. But if you're somebody who likes your work to look a little bit more organic or realistic, it's a really good choice. I'm surprised at the one that I picked for number 2 because going into this, I thought I had a really clear idea about which were going to be my favorites and which weren't. In the number 2 position is Prismacolor. I know, it got knocked down from number 1, and I may have to rethink my entire art wrap for Housetober and put in my number 1 choice instead. I still like them, even though I'm not sure if these new designs are the same. I like the fact that the nib is a little bit taller. I know from experience that I'm really able to use these for several drawings. They don't dry out. In fact, in my experience, the nib will wear out more quickly than the ink. And I like the way they feel. They're a little bit slimmer, and so they feel really nice in my hands. If you have larger hands, you may not like these as much as I do, but I still really, really love these. They make me want to draw. And my number 1 pick after doing this comparison is the Staedtler. I knew I liked them, I just didn't realize how much. I was surprised by this because I really thought I knew them. I've used them before. I knew that I liked them. I knew that they were one of my top 2, but I always thought that I rated Prismacolor a little bit more highly. But they were just such a delight to draw with in this comparison. It felt like I'd gone from driving a Chevy to driving a Rolls Royce. I mean, a Chevy is perfectly serviceable, but it's nowhere near the luxury of a higher end vehicle. So for me, these just were delightful to use. And I think I'm going to use these for the Housetober, at least for the first theme, and see how it goes. They handled the watercolor well. They didn't really bleed. I was able to draw on top of the watercolor pretty easily as well. And overall, I just really like everything about them. I even like the fact that it says you can keep the cap off for 12 hours and it's not going to dry out, although I don't intend to put that to the test. Let me know if you agree with my winner or not. I would really like to hear your opinions, or if there's a fine liner that I haven't used in this comparison. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you all have a beautiful day and happy drawing.